Since the early days of cinema, American horror has had a macabre fascination with fictional serial killers.
How many women in the United States use lipstick?
How many women are there?
I want every one of them scared silly every time she puts any on. Call this baby the lipstick killer. Smack across the front page.
And there's no denying this interest has persisted to the modern day. What has shifted is our representation of killers, how we relate to them, and how we are encouraged to relate to them by the media we consume. To understand this change and what it might be able to tell us about modern society, we must first look at the traditional categorization and function of serial killers in popular media. Serial killers are commonly categorized as a form of cultural other. This categorization, the concept of the anthropological cultural other, is one based purely on our perceived differences. People who are not recognized as part of the self-identity, that traditionally being the culture and identity of Western men, are lumped together as a form of other. Unsurprisingly, this habit of categorizing people into collective groups to be studied based only on the fact that they differ from ourselves is not without issues. The act of categorization itself often functions to objectify people, stripping away their individuality and personal differences. Because of its historic use for classifying non-Western people as different and primitive, the label of the other often carries with it connotations of savagery and danger. The idea that things and people not like us are a threat to the proper civilized Western society. Now, due to their murderous tendencies, we understandably regard both real and fictional serial killers to be a source of danger and to be not like us. These perceived differences allowing us to objectify and dehumanize them through the categorization of a threatening other. But fictional serial killers do not represent just any kind of threatening other. They symbolize particular fears of a dangerous other that originates from within the very society it threatens. They attack our society from the inside out, often posing as a direct threat to the sanctuary of the traditional American family life and values. After all, whereas other classic movie monsters, such as vampires, werewolves, or zombies, can easily be categorized by their marked differences, the often very literal difference in speciation clearly separating us from them, the serial killer is truly threatening in their ability to blend in and appear exactly the same as everyone else. In this way, they are a reminder of the dangers lurking just below the surface of our everyday lives, and sometimes even ourselves.
She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes. Haven't you?
However, over time, the way we view serial killers in horror media has shifted. By the early 1990s, the tidal wave of 70s and 80s emotionless and one-dimensional slashers had already begun to give way to more complex explorations of the killer's psyche. But crucially, these killers were still represented as terrifying in their monstrosity. Regardless of how good they were at hiding, or how human they may appear, their violent urges would eventually reveal them as something different, the monstrous villain the audience is supposed to fear.
Try getting a reservation at Dorset now, you fucking stupid bastard!
This began to change in the early 2000s, when contemporary American horror slowly started to shift, to give us a more compassionate psychopath. These are killers we can not only sympathize with, but can ally ourselves alongside and come to root for. This kind of serial killer is best exemplified in the NBC show Hannibal. Developed by Brian Fuller and based on the Thomas Harris novels, the show ran from 2013 to 2015, primarily exploring Hannibal's early years before imprisonment. The character of Hannibal, here portrayed by Danish actor Mads Mikkelsen, should be a clear representation of a threatening other for American audiences. He is a literal foreigner, a member of the cultural elite, and crucially, his violent transgressions go far beyond that of your average serial killer. For as we all know, Hannibal doesn't just kill his victims.
He's eating them.
And yet, from the very start, the show encourages the audience to align themselves with Hannibal. To quote Fuller, "Every moment consciously plays with the juxtaposition of gorgeousness and visceral terror, with the effect, at times, of slowly luring the audience into a sense of being in collusion with Hannibal." Throughout the show, we spend considerable time getting to know Hannibal through the eyes of Will Graham. Graham's struggles with accepting the violence in his life and himself mirror the audience's own journey of embracing the horror they are presented with and coming to care for a man who should, in any other case, be the irredeemable monster. To be clear, this version of Hannibal is still monstrous. But here, even his most horrific acts are repackaged into part of his charm. Where the previous iterations showed Hannibal's cannibalism to be a savage and monstrous contrast to his life of sophistication, the show stylizes these acts. The many artistic cooking scenes helping turn the very act of consuming human flesh into another example of Hannibal's elegance and high taste. Through this, the show positions us to connect with what is clearly still a form of threatening other, a task it succeeded at for many viewers. In this way, the threatening other of Hannibal has shifted for many to become a reflection of themselves. The possibility of this shift is not that surprising once you realize the categories of the self and the other are rarely as clear-cut as many are led to believe. The reality is individual humans are made up of truly complex, multifaceted identities, and that even with our best attempts to categorize some of them as others, we will almost always overlap with one another. The discovery and embrasure of this overlap is what allows us to come to see ourselves in the other. After all, despite their otherness, serial killers have always traditionally reflected a part of society itself. They are a projection of our social fears and anxieties, representing the real societal aspects that many would rather keep hidden. Now, once we accept this change has begun to happen, the question becomes, what does this shift in representation mean? What can this allegiance with symbols of destructive social forces tell us about American society today? I propose that this connection with the dangerous other reflects an increasingly nihilistic worldview and sense of disillusionment with today's society. An example of a form of nihilistic worldview is itself presented in Hannibal. Nihilistic ideas are considered and tested by many of the main characters, encouraging the audience to also dwell on such concepts.
If he does end up eating you, Bedelia, you'd have it coming.
I can't blame him for doing what evolution has equipped him to do.
Well, if we just do whatever evolution equipped us to do, murder and cannibalism are morally acceptable.
They are acceptable to murderers and cannibals. And you.
And you.
The exploration, and at times acceptance, of these ideas in horror media helps to position us to be able to consider it acceptable to empathize and align with the threatening other instead of their victims. These victims are a key reminder that in this case the threatening other of the serial killer is not just a misunderstood outsider. They are supposed to represent a real danger to our society. After all, even these newer serial killer representations such as Hannibal are always more than willing to commit truly horrific acts against other human beings for their own enjoyment, often including killing innocent people for their own personal gain. Because of this alignment cannot just be seen as a case of viewers becoming more open and accepting of overall difference and fringe identities. Truly, by siding with these monstrous figures such as serial killers, we are not widening the categories of the self and the other, but switching sides and positioning ourselves alongside the threatening other against the rest of society. We no longer feel the same regard for their victims, as we no longer want to protect the family values and idealism they represent. Instead, we have begun to reject these ideals of human exceptionalism and turn to embrace the symbolic destruction of the traditional American dream.